Dawn glazed the aqueduct as Morris padded along the parapet, aubergine-tinted fur catching first light, and his moon-shaped chest blaze flickering in shadow. His round spectacles were smudged again, and his threadbare tweed satchel bulged with unsent letters for people who needed hope. He stalled, wondering if AI meant Allen Iverson, and Esther groaned behind him. He held the line between duty and delay, promising himself the letters would go out soon. Morris said he would send them after he figured out the AI thing. Esther said he kept doing this and it was getting old. Esther kept pace, her eggplant coat dark and sleek, silver-tipped ears twitching at rumors rising from the water below. Her scarf was ink-blotted and doubled, the chipped fountain pen perched behind her left ear like a promise she feared to keep. She liked Eva more than she admitted and respected Morris's courage more than she let him see. When Morris mentioned practice again, she corrected him without looking away from the arches. Esther said Allen Iverson was the one who said to practice, not whatever the scribe meant by generative machines. Eva trotted ahead, eggplant fur freckled along her muzzle and a nervous lopsided grin flashing whenever her bell anklet chimed. Her small sketchbook, strapped with violet twine, hid maps of the aqueduct and secret portraits she could not share. She urged them on, saying they were late for Magical Trevor's noon show because inspiration never waited for definitions. The trio had taken responsibility for the arches after the war left the city short on guardians and long on rumor. Eva said they had to move because Trevor never stalled for a good idea. From an upper ledge, Countess Lopula watched, lime green plumage striped with glossy black chevrons that gleamed like threats. A velvet choker mic cover at her throat matched the portable recorder at her side, its red tally light an unblinking promise. She spoke softly, vowing her family podcast would own the arches by dusk, and that the valley would finally admit it was good. Her focus was on power, not care. Countess Lopula said the arches would belong to their story by sundown. Her siblings were close by. John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt with line-tipped flight feathers and studio headphones hanging like a medal, and Rita with braided crest feathers and a podcast logo pin above a clipboard of listener metrics. They had provisional council licenses as official media during Reconstruction, which gave them control over permits, stages, and stories. Their motivation was naked and simple, validation louder than truth. Their gear and posture made their intent plain. Their plan was simple and ruthless: expose Magical Trevor, the conjurer whose shows under the aqueduct shortened ration lines and softened losses. Rita mapped his routines and placed spotters. John Jacob would plaster QR codes for instant subscriptions. The Countess would narrate how the tricks were never clever. They would trigger trap lights to freeze his hands and cut close-ups to force a confession, dressing it as journalism. The consequences would shame Trevor, humiliate the crowd, and crown the siblings as necessary voices. Countess Lopula said it would finally make the valley admit they were good. Morris found them measuring the central arch and stepped in first, asking them to promote without destroying joy. Countess Lopula cocked her head and argued that joy was a side effect, not a truth claim. Eva's bell chimed as she shifted, and Esther reminded them the aqueduct rested on morale as much as mortar. After the war, John Jacob peeled a QR sticker and slapped it on Morris's satchel like a dare. Morris said the arches needed care, not conquest. Countess Lopula said care could trend if it bowed to them. On the lower promenade, a side story emerged. 3 jade-colored badgers arrived, Willie with a level across his back, Alice with chalky paws, and Marge with a coil of rope escorting a hamster perched on a polished metal. Chief Nibble squeaked through a silver whistle bigger than his face, while an underground knitting circle surfaced from a maintenance hatch. They whispered Pearl 2 like a password and pressed cozy helmets into strangers' paws. A knitter said Pearl 2 as if the stone could hear. By afternoon, the Kestrels secured the Keystone stage with a municipal permit stamped in lime ink. Boom mics hung beneath the arch and lights clipped to carved cornices that once bore emblems of rival kingdoms. Countess Lopula rehearsed while John Jacob paced and Rita circled names on her clipboard. When the foxes approached, The Countess warned the truth would trend whether they helped or not. Countess Lopula said trending would bless the arches if they stopped resisting. The foxes tried a counter. Eva sketched a decoy prop chest while Morris drafted a press note framing Trevor's show as a communal ritual, not a claim. Esther delivered it with logic and a scarf snapping in the wind. But Rita's pen clicked and she said Metric's favorite outrage. John Jacob scanned the note with a camera laugh and posted a smear claiming the Guardians were suppressing journalism. Rita said numbers did not lie. Esther said people did. The fallout hit fast. Trevor cancelled rehearsal and packed his scarves into a crate as the arches fell quiet, the aqueduct hissing like it wanted applause. Countess Lopula climbed onto the keystone and promised a special expose at dusk, her recorder's red tally light glowing. The foxes watched a permit become power, and power bend the crowd. Countess Lopula said the show would go on with or without consent. Under a lamplit arch, Chief Nibbles squeaked a curfew order he did not mean while the Jade Badgers stood uneasy in their borrowed authority. Willie admitted the Kestrels had threatened to audit the maintenance budget. Alice confessed she had signed a noise ordinance to protect the stone. Marge frowned, her rope dangling, and pointed out the ordinance also banned busking and children's instruments by accident. The knitting circle popped up, scolded everyone for skipping stitch night, and left a scarf on a gargoyle spout. Willie said they had to fix a mistake before it hardened. By morning, the complication peaked. The Badgers posted signs listing prohibited items, including kazoos no one remembered adding. A child cried when her kazoo was taken, and Countess Lopula announced on mic that rules were rules, flicking her velvet choker like an applause line. Willie muttered that the language came from Rita. The foxes understood the Kestrels were writing law with the same pens they wrote episodes. Countess Lopula said enforcement proved integrity. Hopelessness took a seat beside them. Morris watched Trevor tape his trunk, his spectacles fogging. He said maybe truth mattered more than feelings, then corrected himself, saying he did not mean Allen Iverson when talking about AI edits. Eva's bell chimed guiltily, and she closed her sketchbook like a door she wished stayed open. Esther stared at the water and weighed love she could not name against a fight she did not want to lose. Morris said he hated how words bent away from care. Conflict flared and went brittle. Morris blamed himself for trusting a note to metrics. Esther snapped that he chased definitions and practiced drills. Eva said all three of them had been cowards about something. They almost chose to let Trevor and the arches fend for themselves. A betrayal of a promise they had never spoken. The knitting circle clucked from another hatch and held up a lumpy sweater, shaped like regret. Eva said they could not leave it like this. They pivoted by starting small and kind. Morris noticed missing skeins from the knitter stash, and Chief Nibbles pointed a tiny paw toward a Kestrel-branded crate. Eva and Esther pried it open, rescued the hamster from being staged as a prop security mascot, and returned the yarn with apologies and biscuits. Willie confronted Rita with the ordinance draft and drew a chalk line through the kazoo ban, saying his chalk belonged to the stone, not metrics. The Badgers watched the foxes risk their standing for a small chief and a secret circle, and something in them steadied. Willie said the stone answered to care, not clicks. Hey there, quick interlude under the arches. If you're enjoying this uprising, remember to like and subscribe so these arches keep standing strong in your feed. Drop a comment with the word slot to tell the algorithm what to audit. Your support helps the right stories trend, not the loudest ones. Willie, Alice, and Marge agreed to join the foxes, and Chief Nibbles could deputize the knitting circle as lookouts. Willie could map echo nodes. Alice knew which sluice gates amplified certain pitches. Marge could rig ropes and nets without harming the stone. Eva remembered Countess Lopula flinching at a child's kazoo trill and losing a whole sentence, and the ban finally made sense. They built a plan: bring back kazoos, place whistlers at echo nodes, layer sound until the Kestrels lost focus, expose the manipulations, and seize the illicit drafts lawfully. Eva said the memory fit the missing piece. They moved fast and gentle. Willie chalked echo stars on walkways and tapped stones until the notes rang true, Alice reopened two side sluices to wake the resonance chambers. Marge draped yarn lines high, tied to harmless anchors. Nuts checked twice. The knitting circle resurfaced, knitting bright cozies for borrowed kazoos so young lips would not chap. Chief Nibbles practiced on a tiny kazoo with fierce squeaks, and no one laughed. Alice said the stone liked to sing when treated right. At the staging arch, ordinary market life continued beside their preparations. An Italian pizza chef in a flour-dusted apron stood under a side arcade and tossed a disc of dough into the air while humming. Sunlight glinted on olive oil in his ladle, and the dough spun once like a small moon. No one looked his way, and the dough came down perfectly. The day held steady on its edge. Countess Slopilla announced the expose with a voice that carried across the valley. John Jacob rolled QR code ribbons along the front row, while Rita lifted her clipboard like a verdict. Trevor stood center stage, pale but stubborn, scarves clenched in steady paws that still trembled. The foxes separated but coordinated, eyes tracking Willie's chalk stars. Esther breathed in and said they were responsible because they knew the arches best and had rallied this community before. Under the keystone, the knitting circle sat like a choir disguised as tourists. Willie raised his paw, Alice set the sluice gates, and Marge lifted a rope-tied handkerchief. Chief Nibbles crawled onto a parapet with his kazoo. Morris, Esther, and Eva met eyes and nodded, and the plan began. Morris said it would be gentle and true. When the Countess cued a trap light, a gentle kazoo line drifted from the east arch, innocent enough to seem accidental. She hesitated, then recovered and stretched the word expose over too many beats. John Jacob tripped on a sticker roll. Rita's pen scratched a zigzag where a straight line should have been. The foxes held their breath and signaled for the second note. Countess Slopilla said it was a minor glitch, but her eyes flickered. Alice swung a gate, and the aqueduct answered, giving the kazoos a chorus that bounced from chalk star to chalk star. The Countess blinked and lost her place. John Jacob stared at his headphones like a riddle. Rita's pin looked small on her harness. Trevor lifted a scarf and stepped aside so the crowd could see the Kestrel's switch box labeled with pre-written prompts. Eva sketched the tableau in 2 strokes and held it up like a mirror for the crowd. Trevor said the real trick was transparency. Marge dropped a loose lattice of yarn lines to tangle microphones instead of birds. Willie tilted a resonance baffle while Chief Nibbles blew one brave squeal that triggered the final echo bloom. The Kestrels tried to shout control back into their show, but the kazoo chorus filled every arch and scattered their focus. Esther read the illegal ordinance draft with the kazoo ban, and Morris presented the crate that had held the stolen yarn. Esther said the law must serve care. Morris said the evidence did not lie. Countess Slopilla lunged for a recorder, but it slid into a knitted cozy and turned her forceful words to muffled noise. John Jacob hopped to peel another sticker and splashed into a shallow fountain Alice had reactivated, QR codes melting like sugar. Rita raised her clipboard for one last judgment, but Eva, voice steady, said the community judged back and found manipulation unfit for public trust. Chief Nibbles squeaked an arrest order, Willie declared the stage unsafe, and the Badgers guided the siblings off the keystone. Eva said the arches remembered who cared for them. Relief moved through the crowd as shoulders lowered and applause turned into laughter. Trevor stayed to finish a small trick, not to prove magic but to prove joy, and the arches seemed to lift with him. The knitting circle unfurled a banner that read "You are enough even without metrics" in a careful seed stitch. The foxes opened their unsent letters and placed them in the paws of people who needed good words. Trevor said joy was the real headline. Repairs followed as order returned. Alice and Willie documented how the Kestrels had overhung lights that stressed old stone, then wrote a rule book that fit the arches like a glove. Marge and the knitting circle wrapped chipped edges in soft, bright knits so no one would bump them again. The council revoked the siblings' media license and shifted the broadcast permit to a rotating community board. Chief Nibbles kept his medal and moved his office into a repurposed tea cart. Willie said rules could protect instead of punish. Morris and Esther finally slowed their argument about AI and Allen Iverson. Morris admitted he had meant writing prompts and predictive text, not a retired basketball legend. Esther confessed she had been deflecting because caring scared her. Eva, smiling with a nervous jingle, said maybe practice was a good word for friendship too. They shared what mattered and accepted that some love would go unreturned, and still they could choose each other as teammates. Esther said choosing each other was enough. The Kestrel siblings faced real consequences. They were banned from public stages and ordered to peel every unauthorized sticker from the Aqueduct stones. Countess Lopula catalogued community archives under the watch of a knitting circle, too busy to bloat John Jacob, washed fountains until the QR ink ran clear, and Rita swept streets with her judgmental pen replaced by a broom. No one clapped. It was not a show. Rita said she understood why applause had stopped. The underground knitting circle dropped their gag and admitted they were never truly secret. They just loved dramatic entrances. They scheduled an open stitch night under the third arch and offered kazoo lessons between rows. They stitched little sashes reading acoustics advisor for the Badgers and one that said Chief of Squeaks for Chief Nibbles. Their yarn cozies kept repaired recorders from rattling and added a soft glow to the stone. A knitter said entrances were better as welcomes. As twilight brushed the arches, Trevor bowed to the crowd and to the trio who had insisted the aqueduct be a place of care. Morris wiped his spectacles and finally mailed a letter. Esther tucked her pen behind her ear and let the quiet be kind. Eva tied new violet twine around her sketchbook. The war between rival kingdoms felt a page farther back as water coursed steady, and people laughed in two languages. Eva's anklet bell chimed, this time from a light pace rather than nerves. Trevor said thank you with a nod that held. They walked the parapet, debating whether an algorithm could make pizza as well as a person who had practiced. Morris corrected himself before Esther had to. They checked the chalk stars and found children drawing new ones in pastel, a game for echoes to keep Bully's weakness close at hand. The Badgers waved from below, and Chief Nibbles squeaked good night in a tone that bounced perfectly. The arches held because many hands chose to hold them. Morris said the choice mattered most. All the slop in this video was generated using AI. This disclaimer was offered for clarity and nothing more. If you appreciated this story, please like and subscribe, and comment the word slop to keep this community's echo strong. Thank you for choosing care over noise.